The story begins on an unseasonably cold evening in early October, when the envelope appeared on the doorstep of Eleanor Gray's small, weathered apartment. It was a peculiar thing, the paper thick and brittle, like something pulled from a century-old trunk. The edges bore faint scorch marks, as though it had narrowly escaped a fire. Her name was written in a careful, slanted hand, but there was no address, no stamp, only the word urgent inked in red beneath the flap. Eleanor hesitated before opening it. She lived alone, with no family to speak of and few friends who would bother with such a dramatic gesture. The weight of the envelope felt wrong in her hands, unnervingly heavy for something so small. Her first instinct was to throw it away, but curiosity, a force she often found as dangerous as it was irresistible, made her slit it open with a knife. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, the ink an unsettling shade of deep violet. The note read, "You are cordially invited to Blackwood Manor, midnight, October 31st. Your attendance is required. E.B." There was no indication of who E.B. was or why they insisted on her presence. Blackwood Manor stirred no memories, yet the name carried an ominous weight. It was as though she had heard it whispered in the shadows of her dreams, a place she had never visited but somehow felt she knew. Eleanor scanned the note for further clues, but the message was frustratingly terse. Still, it didn't feel like a prank. There was an authority in the words, a quiet menace that made her skin crawl. Over the next few days, the invitation gnawed at her. Eleanor had no job tying her down, no pressing commitments to keep her grounded. Her life was a haze of routine and regret, punctuated by vague memories of a childhood that felt more like a story someone else had told her. It was this emptiness, this lack of tether, that ultimately drove her to take the invitation seriously. If nothing else, she reasoned, it might offer a break from the monotony. She spent hours researching Blackwood Manor, combing through dusty library archives and obscure internet forums. What she uncovered was sparse but troubling. The manor had been built in the late 1800s by one Elias Blackwood, a reclusive magnate rumored to dabble in the occult. It was said the house was cursed, abandoned after a series of disappearances and unexplained deaths. There were no photographs, only grainy sketches that showed a sprawling, Gothic structure nestled deep in a forest Eleanor didn't even know existed. By the time October 31st arrived, Eleanor had convinced herself the invitation was a mistake, yet she couldn't shake the feeling she was being drawn there for a reason. She packed a bag, a flashlight, a notebook, a bottle of water, and an old hunting knife that had belonged to her father, and left her apartment just before nightfall. The directions were surprisingly clear, guiding her to a narrow dirt road she had never noticed before. The path snaked through a dense forest, the trees skeletal in the pale moonlight. There was no sound except for the crunch of leaves beneath her boots and the occasional snap of a twig. The further she walked, the thicker the fog became, wrapping around her like cold fingers. When she finally reached the manor, she stopped in her tracks. Blackwood Manor was larger than she had imagined, its blackened stone towers looming against the night sky like jagged teeth. The windows were dark, yet the faint scent of smoke suggested a fire burned somewhere within. Despite its decay, the house seemed alive, its shadows shifting and curling as though aware of her presence. Eleanor hesitated on the cracked stone steps, her breath visible in the icy air. She considered turning back, but the thought felt absurd. The invitation had brought her here, and to leave now would be to admit defeat, to let fear win. She pushed the heavy door, which creaked open with an almost theatrical groan. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The entrance hall was cavernous, lit by a single candelabra that cast flickering shadows across the walls. As Eleanor stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. She froze, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. And then she saw it. On the grand staircase, a figure cloaked in darkness. It was impossible to tell if it was a person or a trick of the light, but it didn't move. It simply stood there, watching, as if waiting for her next move. Eleanor took a step forward, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "Hello," she called, her voice wavering. There was no response, only the faintest echo of her own words. She felt the weight of the invitation in her pocket. The words "your attendance is required" echoing in her mind. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but it was too late to leave. The door was locked. Eleanor turned slowly, her eyes scanning the dimly lit entrance hall for any sign of an escape route. The locked door loomed behind her, an ominous reminder of her sudden imprisonment. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the eerie silence that enveloped the room. The figure on the staircase hadn't moved. Whether it was human or something else, she couldn't tell. But it was there, a dark blot on the edge of her vision, still and unyielding. Summoning what courage she could muster, Eleanor edged toward the left side of the hall, where a second doorway yawned open into darkness. The dim flicker of the candelabra barely illuminated her path, its weak glow casting twisted shadows on the walls. Her footsteps were cautious, the sound muffled by the thick layer of dust coating the floor. Every creak of the warped wooden planks felt deafening, and she winced with every step. The doorway led into a narrow corridor lined with faded wallpaper that seemed to peel and breathe as she passed. The air was colder here, biting and damp, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of rust or blood. Eleanor's flashlight jittered as she swept it across the walls, her trembling hands betraying the fear she refused to fully acknowledge. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though the hallway appeared empty. A low noise broke the silence, a faint rustling, like fabric dragging across the floor. Eleanor froze, clutching the flashlight tighter. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing from somewhere further down the corridor. It was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly rhythmic, as if something was pacing or stalking. She backed up a step, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, oppressive in its weight. Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities, none of them reassuring. She couldn't go back to the entrance hall, not with that shadowed figure waiting for her. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and pressed on, the corridor twisting and turning like a maze designed to disorient. At the end of the hall, she found herself in what appeared to be a sitting room. Faded tapestries clung stubbornly to the walls, their once vivid designs obscured by centuries of grime. A massive fireplace dominated one side of the room, its hearth empty but stained with soot. The furniture was decrepit, the upholstery torn and sagging, as though the weight of the house's malevolence had sunk into its very fibers. On a small table near the fireplace lay an object that didn't belong. A silver pocket watch gleamed faintly in the dim light, its surface pristine, untouched by the decay that marred everything else in the manor. Eleanor approached it cautiously, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the watch's surface, when a voice shattered the silence. "Don't touch that." She spun around, nearly dropping her flashlight. The voice had been soft but commanding, and it had come from the far corner of the room. For a moment, she saw nothing, the shadows too thick to penetrate. But then a figure emerged, a man, gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and haunted. He wore a suit that seemed decades out of fashion, its fabric frayed at the edges. His presence was unsettling, but he didn't seem threatening. At least, not yet. "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "What is this place?" The man regarded her for a long moment before speaking. "This is Blackwood Manor," he said, as though the name itself were explanation enough. His voice carried a weary resignation, as if he had repeated those words countless times before. "And you shouldn't be here." Eleanor's frustration boiled over. "I didn't come here by choice. Someone sent me an invitation. Your attendance is required. Does that mean anything to you?" The man's expression darkened. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "If you were invited," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "then it's already too late. The house has chosen you." Eleanor stared at him, her stomach knotting with dread. "Chosen me for what?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The man didn't reply. Instead, he glanced toward the pocket watch on the table. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice barely audible, "don't let it stop ticking." With that cryptic warning, he turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Eleanor alone with the watch and the suffocating sense that her presence in Blackwood Manor was no accident. Eleanor stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the gleaming pocket watch. The man's cryptic warning rang in her ears like a distant church bell, its significance both urgent and maddeningly unclear. "Don't let it stop ticking." She reached for the watch with trembling fingers, hesitating for just a moment before picking it up. It was unexpectedly warm, as though it had been held moments before. The second hand ticked steadily, its rhythm unnervingly loud in the silent room. There was no chain attached, no markings to suggest its origin. She turned it over and saw a single engraving on the back. "Time reveals all." The word sent a chill down her spine. She slipped the watch into her pocket, uncertain if it was a safeguard or a trap, and scanned the room for any sign of the strange man who had appeared so suddenly. The shadows held no answers, only an oppressive silence. A soft, rhythmic thumping drew Eleanor's attention to a doorway she hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, revealing a narrow passage beyond. She moved toward it, her flashlight casting weak beams of light on the peeling wallpaper. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, as though calling to her. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the sound guiding her like a heartbeat. The passage led to a grand dining hall, and the sight that met her eyes made her breath catch. The room was impossibly large, the high ceilings adorned with cracked frescoes depicting twisted, otherworldly figures. A long table dominated the space, draped with a once elegant cloth, now mottled with age. The table was set for a feast, but the food was grotesque. Platters of rotted meat, wilted vegetables, and mold-covered bread filled the table, as though the feast had been abandoned decades ago, yet refused to fully decay. But what struck Eleanor most were the chairs. They were all occupied by figures. At first, she thought they were statues, their stillness unnerving in the flickering light. But as she stepped closer, her flashlight revealed the truth. They were corpses. Each one was dressed in formal attire, their faces locked in expressions of horror. Some clutched utensils in skeletal hands, while others had toppled onto the table as if struck down mid-meal. The sight was so grotesque that Eleanor had to look away, her stomach churning. A single chair at the head of the table was empty. Unlike the others, it was pristine, its upholstery untouched by dust or decay. It was as if it were waiting for her. She took a step back, instinctively retreating from the silent invitation. But as she moved, the thumping sound returned. This time, it was louder, and it wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from her pocket. Eleanor pulled out the pocket watch, its ticking now erratic, almost frantic. The hand spun wildly, as though caught in a storm. She tried to shake it, to stop its manic spinning, but the harder she tried, the faster it moved. The dining hall grew darker, the flickering candlelight dimming to near nothingness. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the watch stilled, its hands freezing at midnight. A sound like a gust of wind tore through the room, though nothing moved. Then came the whispers. Low, disjointed murmurs filled the space, overlapping and unintelligible. Eleanor turned in circles, her flashlight trembling as she tried to locate the source. The corpses at the table remained still, yet the whispers seemed to emanate from them, as if their long-dead mouths were speaking secrets meant only for her. The empty chair at the head of the table scraped back with a deafening screech, the sound reverberating through the hall like a scream. Eleanor's breath hitched, her body frozen with terror. The chair moved on its own, inching closer to her with each passing second. She stumbled backward, clutching the pocket watch like a talisman. "You must sit," a voice commanded, low and guttural. It wasn't a whisper. It was a voice that filled the room, emanating from everywhere and nowhere. Eleanor shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't belong here," she shouted, her voice breaking. The table rattled violently, plates and goblets tumbling to the floor. The corpses at the table remained unmoving, but their eyes that had been lifeless moments ago, snapped open, their vacant, milky gazes fixed on her. The whispers grew louder, their words finally clear. The feast must continue. Eleanor turned and bolted, running back the way she had come. The whispers chased her, growing louder, more insistent, until they filled her head like a chorus of shrieking voices. She didn't stop until she reached the sitting room, slamming the door shut behind her. She collapsed against it, gasping for breath, the pocket watch still clutched tightly in her hand. The whispers faded, leaving only the ticking of the watch steady once more. But as she looked at the hands, she realized they were no longer moving forward. The second hand now moved in reverse. The ticking of the pocket watch in reverse filled the room, each tick reverberating through Eleanor's mind like a steady drumbeat of dread. She stared at the watch, transfixed, as the second hand moved counterclockwise in defiance of nature. Its deliberate motion seemed to mock her panic, as though the object itself were alive. Eleanor's breath quickened. Was this some sick trick? Or had the man's warning already been broken? The room seemed darker than before, the dim light of her flashlight barely pushing back the shadows. The door she had slammed shut moments ago groaned, as if under unseen pressure. Eleanor pressed her back against it, her heart pounding as though trying to escape her chest. The house was no longer just eerie. It was alive, responding to her every movement, her every fear. Eleanor needed to leave, immediately. Clutching the pocket watch tightly, she scanned the room for another exit. The sitting room was unchanged except for the air, now heavy with the scent of something burning. A faint wisp of smoke curled from the fireplace. It wasn't lit, but embers glowed faintly in the soot-streaked hearth, as though stirred to life by her presence. As she moved closer, the smoke thickened, taking shape. It coiled and twisted, forming ghostly figures that flickered in and out of existence. Faces emerged, distorted, anguished faces with mouths open in silent screams. Eleanor stumbled back, covering her mouth as the faces dissipated into the air. But the embers remained, glowing brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the ticking watch. It was as if the two were linked, their energy feeding off one another. The doorway to the corridor, her only way forward, beckoned her with darkness. Eleanor hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to stay put, to avoid venturing further into the unknown. But the sound of faint whispers returned, echoing from the hallway. They were different now, clearer, sharper. They weren't words but soft, mocking laughter. It was as if the house itself were laughing at her terror. Gripping her flashlight and the watch, Eleanor stepped into the corridor, her footsteps tentative. The air felt colder than before, biting against her skin. The narrow passage seemed to stretch endlessly, each step revealing no end, only more darkness. The wallpaper, once merely peeling, now seemed to ripple, as though it were alive. A faint glow began to appear ahead, casting an unnatural light on the path. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she reached the source of the glow. A mirror hung on the wall, its frame ornate and tarnished, its surface pulsing with a faint, bluish light. She approached cautiously, her reflection distorted and fractured like a shattered window. The mirror seemed to vibrate, emitting a low hum that resonated in her chest. As she stared into the glass, the reflection shifted. It no longer showed her. Instead, it depicted the dining hall she had just fled. The corpses around the table were animated now, their skeletal hands clinking goblets together in a macabre toast. At the head of the table sat a figure she didn't recognize, until she realized it was her. She was seated in the once empty chair, her face pale and lifeless, her eyes dark hollows. Eleanor stumbled back from the mirror, shaking her head in disbelief. The image in the glass held steady, her reflection raising a goblet to its lips and smiling, a smile that wasn't hers. She wanted to smash the mirror, to break the connection between herself and the haunting vision. But as she raised her flashlight, the whispers returned, louder now, echoing all around her. The feast must continue, they chanted, over and over, each word driving deeper into her mind. Eleanor dropped to her knees, clutching her head as the voices became unbearable. The pocket watch still in her hand, grew hotter, burning her palm. She screamed and hurled it down the corridor, where it landed with a metallic clink. The whispers stopped. Silence enveloped the space, so sudden and complete that it left Eleanor disoriented. She stood, trembling, and turned to retrieve the watch. But it wasn't on the floor where she had thrown it. Instead, it was back in her pocket, its ticking loud and relentless. She pulled it out, her hands shaking. The second hand had stopped its backward motion, now spinning forward again, but faster, much faster. Suddenly, the corridor began to shift. The walls rippled, and the floor tilted as if the house were collapsing inward. Eleanor grabbed onto the nearest wall for support, her fingers sinking into the damp, crumbling wallpaper. A loud, piercing sound rang out, like the tolling of a bell. With each chime, the house seemed to twist further, the passage narrowing around her. She had no choice but to move forward, stumbling toward an unseen end. As she pushed on, the whispers began again, not in mocking laughter this time, but in pleading voices. "Help us," they begged. "Set us free." Eleanor's resolve wavered. Who were these voices? Were they remnants of the manor's dark history? Or had the house somehow trapped souls like hers? At last, the corridor opened into a new space, a library. The room was vast and impossibly tall, with shelves stretching into darkness. Books littered the floor, their pages torn and scattered like fallen leaves. In the center of the room stood a single desk, and on it, a journal lay open, its pages blank except for a single line written in dark, smudged ink. "Time binds us all." Eleanor approached the journal, compelled to touch it despite her fear. As her fingers grazed the page, the pocket watch began to tick louder, its rhythm syncing with the pounding of her heart. The whispers returned, one voice louder than the rest. "You must understand to escape." She stared at the journal, the empty pages beginning to fill with words that seemed written by an unseen hand. The story it told wasn't just the house's history, it was her own. And as she read, the lines between the past, present, and future began to blur, dragging her deeper into the mansion's grip. The words in the journal flowed like ink poured from an unseen quill, forming sentences that compelled Eleanor's eyes to follow them. The script was elegant but unervingly precise, as if written by a machine rather than a human hand. Each line etched a story that sent shivers down her spine. It began with the construction of the mansion, described as a place meant to bind the past to the future. The builders were nameless, and the purpose of the house remained shrouded in mystery, save for cryptic mentions of cycles and keepers. Eleanor turned the pages with trembling fingers. The narrative shifted from the mansion's origins to the lives of those who had inhabited it. Each page chronicled a different family, their rise and inevitable ruin. Wealth and grandeur gave way to madness, despair, and violent ends. The cycle repeated with chilling regularity, and as Eleanor flipped the pages, she noticed a pattern. Each story ended abruptly, as if unfinished. When she reached the final entry, the blank pages mocked her anticipation. She hesitated, waiting for words to appear as they had before. The silence of the room grew oppressive, broken only by the relentless ticking of the pocket watch. And then, just as she began to close the book, the ink began to flow once more. This time, the story wasn't about a family or the mansion's history. It was about her. The lines described her arrival, the events in the sitting room, the dining hall, and even her encounter with the mirror. Eleanor's breath hitched as she read the final line. The next chapter begins with a choice. A low rumbling echoed through the library, shaking the shelves. Dust cascaded from the heights, and books tumbled to the floor. The desk trembled beneath her hands, forcing her to back away as the journal snapped shut on its own. The rumbling ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. Eleanor's flashlight flickered, its beam catching movement in the shadows. She wasn't alone. A figure stepped forward from the darkness between the shelves. It was the man who had given her the pocket watch, but something was different. His form was less distinct, as if he were fading from existence. His eyes glowed faintly, and his voice echoed unnaturally when he spoke. "You've reached the threshold, Eleanor. The choice is yours. "What choice?" she demanded, her voice cracking under the weight of fear and frustration. "What's happening to me? Why am I here?" He gestured toward the journal, now glowing faintly on the desk. "The mansion binds those who enter. It draws in the lost, the desperate, the curious, and offers them a role in its cycle. Some become its keepers, others its prisoners. You must decide your place." Eleanor's mind raced. "I don't want any part of this. I just want to leave." The man's expression softened, though his form continued to waver like smoke. "Leaving isn't as simple as walking out the door. The house won't let you go unless you fulfill your role." In time, he glanced at the pocket watch in her hand. "Time is running out." Before Eleanor could respond, the rumbling returned, louder and more violent than before. The shelves began to collapse inward, sending a cascade of books and debris toward her. She dove to the ground, shielding her head as the library seemed to implode. When the chaos subsided, she found herself alone once more. The journal was gone, the desk reduced to splinters. She clutched the pocket watch, its ticking now erratic, almost frantic. The man's cryptic words echoed in her mind. "Fulfill your role." What role? Keeper or prisoner? Was that her only choice? She stumbled to her feet, searching for an exit. The library's walls were closing in, the space shrinking with every passing moment. A doorway materialized in the far corner, a rectangle of faint light cutting through the encroaching shadows. With no other options, Eleanor sprinted toward it, the floor beneath her buckling with every step. She passed through the doorway just as the library collapsed entirely, the sound like a thunderclap in her ears. She emerged into a circular room she hadn't seen before. The walls were lined with clocks of every size and design, their hands spinning wildly, some forward, some backward. In the center stood a pedestal, and atop it was the journal, pristine and untouched. Eleanor approached cautiously, her steps echoing in the stillness. The journal's cover bore a single word now: choose. Her heart raced as she reached for the book, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. As her fingers brushed the cover, the pocket watch in her hand began to glow, its heat searing her skin. She cried out, but instead of dropping it, she clung to it tighter. The room blurred, the clock's spinning hands merging into a vortex of light and shadow. A voice, hers but not hers, whispered in her mind, "The choice is not yours alone." And with that, the chapter ended not with resolution, but with the beginning of something far more dangerous. Eleanor's vision swam as the clocks spun faster, their faces blurring into indistinct circles of light. The journal under her fingertips pulsed faintly, as though alive, sending waves of warmth through her hands. She tried to steady herself, gripping the edge of the pedestal, but the room's spinning felt unrelenting. The pocket watch in her palm burned like a brand, yet she couldn't bring herself to release it. Instead, she held on tighter, as though letting go would sever her last thread of control. When the motion stopped, Eleanor stumbled backward. The room was no longer the clock-filled chamber. Instead, she found herself in a cavernous hall. The walls were stone, draped with heavy tapestries depicting unfamiliar scenes. Battles, ceremonies, and sacrifices were woven in dark, brooding colors. Torches flickered on iron sconces, their flames casting distorted shadows that danced like restless spirits. At the center of the hall stood an enormous pendulum, its blade gleaming in the firelight. It swung slowly, cutting through the air with an ominous hum. Below it lay a mosaic floor, its pattern spiraling outward from a single point, a dark, circular stain that Eleanor couldn't bring herself to identify. The pendulum's motion seemed to sync with her heartbeat, a steady rhythm that drew her closer despite her growing unease. She approached cautiously, her footsteps echoing. The air felt heavier near the pendulum, charged with an invisible force. Carved into the base of the pendulum structure were words she couldn't read. The script was ancient, jagged, and filled with symbols that seemed to shift when she looked directly at them. The longer she stared, the more the letters seemed to align into meaning. And finally, a phrase emerged in her mind. "Time demands a witness." A soft sound drew Eleanor's attention, a faint sobbing, barely audible over the pendulum's steady swing. She turned, scanning the hall, but saw no one. The sound persisted, growing louder, more desperate. It wasn't just sobbing now, but words fractured and pitiful. "Help us, free us." Eleanor spun around, her flashlight illuminating the empty space. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The only response was the pendulum's hum and the whispers of unseen voices. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, layering over one another in a cacophony of pleas and warnings. "Beware, choose wisely, don't trust them." Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging the hall into darkness. The torches dimmed, their flames shrinking to feeble embers. Panic welled in her chest as she fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against her palm. When it finally sputtered back to life, she gasped. Figures stood around the pendulum. Faint, translucent forms, their faces obscured, but their outlines unmistakably human. The figures swayed in time with the pendulum, their heads bowed as if in prayer or resignation. Eleanor's instinct was to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, the weight of the pocket watch in her hand like an anchor. One of the figures looked up, its face still blurry, but its eyes piercingly clear, two pinpricks of light that bore into her. It raised an arm, pointing directly at her. "The witness," it said, its voice reverberating through the hall. The other figures turned to face her, their heads moving in unison. "The witness," they echoed, their voices overlapping like a distorted choir. The pendulum's rhythm grew louder, each swing cutting through the oppressive air. "I don't understand," Eleanor shouted, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The lead figure stepped forward, its movements smooth and otherworldly. It extended a hand, palm up, and in its center was a reflection, her reflection. But the image was wrong. The face staring back at her wasn't her own, not entirely. It was aged, worn, and hollow, with sunken eyes and lips twisted into a grimace. The figure spoke again. "Time takes all." Eleanor staggered backward, her grip tightening on the pocket watch. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, pressing against her skull like a vice. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing it all to stop, but the voices only grew stronger. The journal's words from earlier came back to her. The next chapter begins with a choice. When she opened her eyes, the pendulum had stopped mid-swing, its blade gleaming directly above the dark stain on the floor. The figures were gone, and the hall was eerily still. On the pedestal beneath the pendulum, a small key rested, its metal tarnished but its shape intricate and deliberate. The whispers quieted, replaced by a single, distinct voice in her mind. "The key unlocks what you seek, or what you fear." Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the key. Every instinct screamed at her to leave it, to turn and run from this nightmare. But deep down, she knew there was no escape without understanding. Slowly, reluctantly, she picked up the key. It was cold to the touch, sending a shiver through her body. As soon as she grasped it, the pendulum resumed its motion, faster now, its hum rising to a deafening roar. The ground beneath her trembled, the floor cracking and splintering. Eleanor clutched the key and pocket watch tightly, bracing herself as the hall seemed to collapse around her. Darkness surged forward like a wave, consuming everything in its path. Just before it overtook her, a doorway appeared ahead, faintly glowing. With no other choice, Eleanor ran, diving through the light and leaving the pendulum, the figures, and the whispers behind. But the key in her hand felt heavier now, as though it carried more than just metal. It carried the weight of the mansion's secrets and her role within them. Eleanor landed hard on the cold, uneven floor, the breath knocked from her lungs. For a moment, she lay still, clutching the key and the pocket watch as if they were lifelines. The air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly metallic, like the scent of a long-forgotten cellar. She pushed herself up, her flashlight flickering weakly. The space around her was shrouded in heavy shadows, broken only by the dim glow of her light. She appeared to be in a narrow corridor, its walls carved from rough stone. Water dripped from the ceiling in rhythmic plinks, pooling in shallow depressions on the floor. The air was colder here, biting through her thin jacket and chilling her to the bone. Eleanor shivered, her pulse still racing from the chaos she had fled. The key in her hand felt unnaturally heavy, its intricate design almost hypnotic. She ran her fingers over its grooves, feeling symbols etched into its surface. The key seemed to hum faintly, an energy pulsing from it that resonated with the pocket watch in her other hand. She had no idea what it unlocked, but the mansion had made one thing clear. Nothing in this place was random. As Eleanor ventured forward, the corridor stretched endlessly, its walls closing in with each step. The oppressive darkness pressed against her, whispering doubts and fears into her mind. Was she walking in circles? Was the mansion leading her to some unseen doom? The thought gnawed at her, but she kept moving. Stopping felt like surrendering to the unknown, and she refused to give it that power. After what felt like hours, the corridor opened into a larger chamber. The room was circular, with a high domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness. At the center stood a massive door, its surface covered in strange carvings that writhed and shifted as if alive. The door pulsed faintly, glowing in time with the vibrations from the key in her hand. It was as if the two objects were speaking to each other in a language she couldn't comprehend. Eleanor hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The door radiated a sense of finality, as if passing through it would set something irreversible into motion. But what choice did she have? The mansion seemed to demand progression, punishing those who lingered. Taking a deep breath, she approached the door and inserted the key into a small, jagged slot at its center. As the key turned, the carvings on the door erupted into motion. The shapes rearranged themselves, forming a scene that played out like a living tapestry. Eleanor watched in horrified fascination as the images revealed a story. People entering the mansion, lured by promises of wealth, knowledge, or salvation, only to become trapped in its endless cycle. The final scene showed a figure standing where she now stood, key in hand, faced with the same choice. The door creaked open, its weight groaning against the hinges. A rush of cold air spilled into the chamber, carrying with it the faint sound of voices, soft, pleading, and eerily familiar. Eleanor stepped through, the world beyond the door swimming into focus. It was a grand hall, but unlike the decayed, haunted spaces she had seen before. This room was pristine, glittering with gold and crystal, its floors polished to a mirror-like shine. It was beautiful, yet deeply wrong, as if perfection itself had been corrupted. At the far end of the hall stood a figure, draped in a flowing black veil. The figure was motionless, its presence both commanding and unnerving. Eleanor's instinct screamed at her to retreat, but the door behind her had already sealed shut. She was trapped with whatever this was. "Eleanor," the figure said, its voice smooth and resonant, cutting through the air like a blade. "You've come far, further than most. Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figure raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate. The veil lifted slightly, revealing only a sliver of what lay beneath. An empty void, swirling with faint shapes that defied comprehension. "I am the keeper," it said, "the guardian of this place and its truths. You hold the key, and now you must decide. Decide what?" Eleanor's grip tightened on the pocket watch, its ticking erratic. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just want to leave." The keeper tilted its head, as if amused. "No one truly leaves. The mansion binds all who enter. But you have the potential to reshape its purpose, to end its torment or perpetuate it. The choice lies within you." Eleanor's heart pounded as the room began to shift around her, the walls melting into shifting visions. Families torn apart, lives consumed, and whispers of liberation. The mansion wasn't just a trap. It was alive, feeding on those who entered. And now it wanted her to play a role in its twisted ecosystem. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The keeper's void-like visage flickered, the shapes within it growing sharper, more menacing. Refusal is a choice in itself, but the mansion does not forgive those who deny its will. Eleanor stared at the swirling chaos around her, her mind racing. The weight of the key grew heavier in her hand, as if it, too, anticipated her decision. She had come so far, but was she ready to take on the burden of this place? Could she even trust the keeper? Or was this just another trap in the mansion's endless games? The hall grew silent, waiting. The next chapter would begin, but only with her choice. The silence in the grand hall was deafening, a palpable weight that pressed against Eleanor's chest as she clutched the key tighter. The keeper stood still at the far end, its veiled form shimmering faintly, as though it were not entirely tethered to this reality. The air between them seemed alive, crackling with unspoken tension. Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts a tangle of fear, defiance, and the unshakable need to survive. What does it mean to reshape the mansion? Eleanor asked, her voice quivering. She hated how small it sounded in the vast, echoing space. What would I have to do? The keeper's void-like visage flickered again, the shapes within it swirling faster. The mansion is not merely stone and timber. It is will and hunger. It thrives on the cycles you've witnessed, souls entering, struggling, succumbing. But with the key, you may disrupt the cycle. Open doors long sealed, or close them forever. Bend its essence to your will. Eleanor took a step forward, despite the terror that churned in her gut. Why me? Why do I have this potential you keep talking about? The keeper's veil rippled, as if laughing silently. You underestimate yourself, as most do. Those drawn here carry within them a flicker of defiance, a yearning that the mansion hungers to extinguish. But you've resisted its whispers, its lures. You've endured. That makes you unique. The words sank in, heavy with implication. Eleanor had felt the mansion's pull, its insidious attempts to manipulate her thoughts and twist her fears. But she had clung to her sense of self, driven by the sheer, stubborn desire to escape. Now, standing here, she wasn't sure if her survival had been an act of strength, or if she had simply been spared for this moment. What happens if I destroy the cycle? She asked, her voice steadier now. If I end this? The keeper's form stilled, its veil darkening. The mansion feeds on its cycle. To sever it would starve its will. It would fall into ruin, taking all within it to oblivion. Those who remain trapped here would find no redemption, only an end. And if I let it continue, Eleanor pressed, her nails digging into the cool metal of the key. Then you become its steward, the keeper replied. You will inherit its power and its curse, guiding those who enter to their fate. You will preserve the mansion's existence, for it cannot persist without a master. The proposition sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. On one hand, destruction meant freedom, an end to the mansion's terror, even if it came at a cost. On the other, preservation meant becoming part of the nightmare, wielding the mansion's power, but forever bound to its will. Neither path felt like victory. Before Eleanor could respond, the hall began to shift. The glittering gold of the walls melted away, revealing the crumbling decay she had seen throughout the mansion. The polished floor warped and cracked, spreading like a spiderweb. Shadows spilled into the room, whispering indecipherable words that made her skin crawl. The mansion itself seemed impatient, pressing her for a decision. I need more time, Eleanor said, her voice cracking. I can't make this choice without knowing more. The keeper moved closer, its presence growing more oppressive. Time is a luxury this place does not grant. But the mansion respects action. Prove your resolve, and you may earn the clarity you seek. Before Eleanor could ask what that meant, the room shifted again. The hall collapsed into darkness, and she found herself standing at the entrance of a new corridor. This one was unlike any she had encountered before. The walls were covered in jagged mirrors, each reflecting warped and distorted versions of herself. Some showed her as she was battered and exhausted, while others depicted her in states of unspeakable horror, bloodied, decayed, or twisted into monstrous forms. At the far end of the corridor stood another door, smaller, and less ornate than the one she had opened earlier. The key in her hand pulsed with a faint warmth, urging her forward. The keeper's voice echoed in her mind, low and resonant. "Prove your will, Eleanor. Only then will you understand." The distorted reflections seemed to watch her as she stepped forward, their eyes following her every move. As she passed, some of the mirrors cracked, splintering with sharp, echoing sounds. The air grew colder with each step, and her breath came in visible puffs. She could feel the mansion pressing in on her, its presence growing heavier, more insistent. When she reached the door, she hesitated. The key in her hand felt alive, thrumming with energy. She glanced back at the mirrored corridor, the fractured versions of herself staring back with expressions she couldn't decipher. Was this another trap, another game? Or was it the first step toward unraveling the mansion's secrets? Taking a deep breath, Eleanor inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. The sound of whispers drifted up from the depths, faint but insistent. Gritting her teeth, Eleanor stepped through, the door slamming shut behind her. Whatever awaited her below, she would face it head-on. As the whispers grew louder, Eleanor tightened her grip on the pocket watch and descended into the abyss, her resolve hardening with each step. The mansion's games weren't over, but neither was her determination to survive. Eleanor descended the spiral staircase, the oppressive darkness swallowing her more with each step. Her hand clung to the cold railing, its surface slick and unyielding, as if the mansion itself were attempting to make her release her grip. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chaotic chorus of fragmented voices. Some sounded pleading, others mocking, but all seemed to be calling her name. She felt the weight of their intent pressing against her mind, like claws scratching at the edge of her sanity. The steps seemed endless, a dizzying loop that defied logic. Eleanor paused, unsure of how long she had been descending. Her legs ached, her breaths were shallow, and the air grew colder. She glanced upward, hoping to see the faint light of the door she had entered, but it was gone. Above her was nothing but an infinite void, the stairwell having erased her path of retreat. Finally, the staircase ended, depositing her into a cavernous room. The floor beneath her feet was no longer stone, but a strange, pulsing surface that felt alive. The walls of the room shimmered with a faint green glow, revealing carvings that writhed and shifted as she tried to focus on them. They seemed to depict scenes of torment, figures trapped in endless loops of despair, their distorted faces twisted in agony. Eleanor shuddered and turned her gaze away. In the center of the room stood an ornate pedestal, its surface inlaid with a swirling pattern of black and gold. Resting atop, it was an object that immediately drew her attention. A mask, pale and smooth, its expression blank but unervingly lifelike. The whispers in the room grew deafening as she approached, a cacophony of emotions. Anger, fear, desperation, all radiating from the mask. Her pulse quickened as she drew closer, her instincts screaming at her to stop. "Touch it," a voice commanded. Unlike the fragmented whispers, this voice was singular, calm, and eerily familiar. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, reverberating in her mind. Eleanor froze, her hand hovering inches above the mask. "What happens if I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it said, "The mask sees truth. It reveals what lies beneath and binds it to you. With it, you may gain clarity, perhaps even control, but the cost is yours to discover." Eleanor hesitated. The mansion had already proven itself to be a master manipulator, bending reality and her perception to its will. Yet, the promise of clarity was tantalizing. The mask could be the key to understanding the mansion's nature, a way to gain the upper hand in its twisted games. But at what price? She thought of the mirror she had passed earlier, the grotesque reflections of herself. Was this another way for the mansion to warp her mind? Or was it offering her a tool to fight back? Steeling herself, Eleanor reached out and grasped the mask. The moment her fingers touched its surface, The room erupted in a blinding flash of light. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against her ears. The mask grew warm in her hands, its blank surface shifting as if alive. Before she could react, the mask lunged from her grip and affixed itself to her face, sealing itself against her skin. Panic surged through her, and she clawed at the edges of the mask, but it wouldn't budge. Her vision blurred, and a wave of nausea rolled over her. Then, suddenly the room changed. The green glow vanished, replaced by an ethereal light that illuminated every corner. The writhing carvings on the walls stilled, their images sharpening into crystal-clear depictions of the mansion's history. Through the mask, Eleanor saw everything. She saw the mansion's origins, built by a man consumed by obsession, a figure who had sought to harness the mansion's power to defy death itself. She saw the cycles the keeper had spoken of, countless souls drawn to the mansion, their fates twisted and manipulated to sustain its existence. She saw herself, standing at the center of it all, her actions rippling outward to shape the mansion's future. The vision shifted, and she was thrust into another scene. She was no longer in the cavernous room, but in a long-abandoned nursery. Dust coated the furniture, and the faint scent of decay hung in the air. In the corner, a small figure sat with its back to her. It was a child, its shoulders shaking as though it were crying. Eleanor's heart clenched, a surge of protectiveness overtaking her fear. She took a tentative step forward, her voice soft. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The child turned slowly, and Eleanor gasped. Its face was a mirror of her own, pale and streaked with tears, but its eyes were hollow voids that seemed to pierce through her soul. The child smiled, a grotesque parody of innocence, and whispered, "You can't save them. You couldn't even save yourself." The room dissolved, and Eleanor was back in the cavern. The mask released its grip on her face, falling to the floor with a dull thud. She staggered backward, gasping for air, her mind reeling from what she had seen. The keeper's voice echoed in her mind once more. "You see now, Eleanor, the mansion is not merely a place. It is a reflection, a magnification of those who enter. To reshape it, you must first confront yourself. Only then will you understand what must be done." Eleanor stared at the mask, its blank surface now marred by faint cracks that seemed to form the outline of a face. She didn't know whether she had gained clarity or fallen deeper into the mansion's trap. All she knew was that the path forward had become infinitely more dangerous, and the truth was far more terrifying than she had imagined. After the unsettling encounter with the mask, Eleanor found herself, once again, standing in the center of the eerie, shifting room. The pulsating surface beneath her feet had faded, replaced by a cold, damp stone floor, as though the mansion itself had responded to the vision she had experienced. She still felt the lingering weight of the mask's presence, even though it had fallen away. Her thoughts were fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror, fragments of past choices, distorted memories, and vague horrors all intermingled. What had she truly learned from the mask? Was the truth it offered genuine? Or was it simply another manipulation, another layer of deception? She rubbed her face, as if to scrub away the phantom sensations left by the mask's touch. It had promised clarity, but all it had done was deepen the mystery, blurring the lines between what was real and what was part of the mansion's twisted illusion. The figure of the child, her own face twisted in agony, lingered in her mind, but she had to move forward. The vision had shown her the mansion's origins, the terrible price it exacted from those who entered, and most horrifying of all, her own reflection in the future. She couldn't ignore the implications. The mask, the child, the endless cycle, it all pointed to something greater, something she hadn't yet understood. Eleanor turned away from the pedestal, her eyes scanning the room for any hint of direction. The walls had stopped shifting, the unsettling carvings now frozen in place, but their meaning remained elusive. It was as though the mansion had momentarily paused, waiting for her to make the next move. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the room was not simply static. It was watching her, waiting for her to decide. The stillness in the air pressed in on her, suffocating and heavy. She reached for the door that had appeared in the far corner of the room. There had been no door there moments before, but now it was unmistakable, its weathered wood marked by deep grooves, as if it had been there for centuries. The room was shifting again, but this time it seemed less like a change of scenery and more like a natural progression, an inevitable step. The mansion was steering her, pushing her towards something, or perhaps, as she suspected, towards someone. As she crossed the threshold of the door, the atmosphere shifted once more. She found herself in a long, dimly lit hallway, its walls lined with ornate portraits. Each painting seemed to depict the same face, though the expressions of the individuals varied, some smiling, others frowning, a few even glaring with unsettling intensity. Eleanor felt the cold eyes of the figures following her as she moved down the corridor. The hallway seemed endless, stretching out before her with no discernible end, no promise of escape. The paintings, the dim light, the suffocating silence, it was all too familiar. She had seen this before, but where? Her pulse quickened as the realization hit her. This was the same hallway she had passed through when she first entered the mansion. The same one where the mirrors had reflected her image, warped and twisted. Had she circled back to the beginning? Was she trapped in some kind of looping nightmare? She stopped, her heart hammering in her chest, and looked back toward the door she had just passed through. The entrance was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the paint peeling and cracked, as though it had never been there at all. For a moment, Eleanor felt a rush of panic. She had been here before, yes, but this time was different. The mansion had changed again, but the changes weren't simply physical, they were psychological. The walls, the paintings, the very air around her seemed to mock her sense of reality, making her question whether she could ever trust her own perceptions again. The mask had shown her the truth, but had it been the whole truth? Or had it been yet another illusion, one that led her deeper into the mansion's web? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. If there was one thing the mansion had taught her, it was that fear and confusion were the tools it wielded most effectively. She had to resist. She had to move forward, even if she didn't understand where that path would lead. The figures in the paintings seemed to shift, their eyes narrowing as though urging her to take action. Eleanor continued walking, her footsteps slow but determined. As she moved deeper into the hallway, the paintings became more vivid, the expressions of the people in them growing more intense, as if they were alive, trapped in their frames. She came upon a large mirror at the end of the hallway, its frame gold and intricately carved. Unlike the other mirrors she had encountered, this one was clear and unclouded. Without thinking, she approached it, drawn to its reflective surface. When she gazed into the mirror, she didn't see her own reflection. Instead, she saw a figure standing behind her, a silhouette shrouded in shadow. Her heart stopped, and she turned quickly, but no one was there. The figure in the mirror remained, its dark outline shifting and swirling. Then it spoke softly, almost a whisper, "You are closer than you think." The words sent a jolt of recognition through her, a cold rush of dread that filled her veins. She had heard that voice before, soft, almost hypnotic, with an edge of something dark and dangerous. It was the same voice that had spoken to her in the mask's visions, the one that had promised clarity and truth. It had to be the mansion's voice, or whatever force controlled it. Eleanor's reflection in the mirror began to change. Her face twisted, contorted, until it was no longer her own, but a grotesque, distorted version, an expression of anguish that mirrored the faces in the paintings. Her hands reached up involuntarily, trying to stop the transformation, but it was no use. She couldn't escape it. The reflection began to move independently of her, its eyes widening in terror as it whispered, "It's too late." In that moment, Eleanor realized the full extent of her situation. The mansion had never been a physical place. It was a manifestation of her own mind, her fears, her doubts, her memories. The images, the voices, the distortions, they were all reflections of herself, of her fractured psyche. She wasn't trapped in a house. She was trapped in her own mind. The true heart of the house was not some hidden chamber or ancient secret. It was the darkness inside her own soul. The mansion had not simply been guiding her. It had been revealing her truth, exposing her darkest fears, her deepest regrets, her most haunting memories. And now, as she faced her own reflection, she understood that the path forward would not be one of escape. It would be one of confrontation, of battling not just the mansion, but herself. The mansion's oppressive atmosphere pressed down on Eleanor with increasing intensity. The mirror, its reflective surface still warped with her distorted image, hung suspended in the air like a threat waiting to reveal itself. For a brief moment, she stood frozen, staring at the twisted reflection that was no longer just a vision, but a reality manifesting before her. The figure, her own face contorted with fear, continued to whisper in a voice that sent shivers down her spine. It's too late. But what did that mean? Too late for what? The question circled her mind like a ravenous predator, devouring her sense of control. Eleanor turned away from the mirror, desperate to escape the suffocating presence it held over her. But as her gaze shifted down the hallway, she realized that no matter which direction she chose to go, the mansion seemed to have no end, no path to freedom. She had been walking through the same endless corridors for what felt like hours, but the mansion seemed to be toying with her, folding in on itself, creating an illusion of infinite space where there was none. Every corner she turned, every doorway she passed through, revealed only more of the same haunted faces in the paintings, the same walls of crumbling stone. Each room seemed like a mirror, reflecting her disjointed thoughts, her mounting confusion. The deeper she ventured into the mansion, the more she realized that it wasn't just the house itself that had changed. She had changed too. Each passing moment brought a new layer of disorientation, a new sense of unease as she confronted the very nature of her reality. She had begun this journey seeking answers, trying to unravel the mystery of the mansion's origin and its hold on her. But now, it seemed that the mansion was revealing something much darker, the nature of her own psyche, fractured and unstable. With each step, she felt as though she were walking through her own memories, through the corridors of her past that she had long buried. Her childhood home, the unsettling feeling she had never quite shaken. The abandoned playground in her neighborhood, once a place of joy, now a source of deep unease. The laughter of children that echoed like ghosts in her ears. The sense of isolation, the constant feeling of being watched by something she couldn't name. Eleanor paused in front of another doorway. This time, the door was ajar, its surface marked by deep gouges, as if something had scratched at it from the inside. She hesitated before pushing it open, not knowing what to expect. But the moment her hand made contact with the door, a wave of memories rushed over her, drowning her in their intensity. She saw her mother's face, her father's stern gaze, and the feeling of suffocating silence that always filled the house. The same house where her brother had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but a trail of unanswered questions. She had never fully processed her brother's disappearance, always telling herself that it had been an accident, that it was something she couldn't understand. But now, as the memories resurfaced in the mansion's oppressive silence, she realized that there was more to the story, something darker, hidden just beneath the surface. The house seemed to know, to understand what she had never allowed herself to confront. The door creaked open to reveal a room bathed in an eerie, pale light. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, each image more disturbing than the last. Faces of people she didn't recognize stared back at her, their eyes wide with terror, as though they had been captured in their final moments. But it wasn't the faces that terrified her. It was the feeling of familiarity, the unsettling sense that she had seen these people before. She couldn't place them, couldn't figure out why their presence felt so intimately tied to her own history. As she stepped further into the room, her eyes were drawn to a small, dusty table in the center. On it sat a photograph, its edges curled with age. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the image. It was a family portrait, her family, but it was not the version of her family she remembered. In this photograph, her brother was standing next to her, his face smiling, his eyes full of life. But there was something wrong. The background was blurred, distorted, as if the photo itself were a distortion of reality. The room seemed to close in around her as her heart raced. She reached out, trembling, to touch the photograph, and as her fingers brushed the glass, a voice echoed through the room. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was unmistakable. "You left me," the voice whispered. Eleanor spun around, her mind racing. Was it a trick of the mansion? A manifestation of her guilt, her unresolved emotions? Or was it something more? The air grew thick with tension, and she suddenly felt an overwhelming need to leave the room, to escape the suffocating grip of the past. But as she turned to go, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. She was trapped. For a moment, panic gripped her, but then something strange happened. The room around her began to shift, the photographs on the walls blurring and reforming into new images, new faces, faces she had never seen but somehow knew. They were all looking at her with the same expression, accusatory, angry, as though they were silently demanding an explanation for something she didn't understand. Eleanor staggered backward, her mind struggling to make sense of the flood of images and voices. The mansion had been silent for so long, but now it was alive, thrumming with an energy that seemed to reach into her very soul. The photographs, the voices, the whispers, they were all connected. It was as if the mansion had become a living thing, feeding off her emotions, her memories, her guilt. The walls seemed to close in once more, but this time, Eleanor didn't feel as if she were losing herself in the madness. Instead, she felt a strange clarity. The mansion was not just a physical place. It was a mirror to her own fractured psyche, a place where her darkest memories and regrets had taken form. It wasn't the mansion that had power over her. It was herself. The things she had buried, the truths she had never allowed herself to face, had come back to haunt her. And now, there was no turning back. The mansion's grip was tightening, pulling her deeper into its labyrinthine corridors, forcing her to confront the past she had long tried to escape. She had come to this place seeking answers, but what she had found was something far more terrifying: the truth about herself. Eleanor had no clear sense of time as she wandered deeper into the mansion. The room she entered, once mysterious, had become increasingly hostile. Each hallway was suffused with a sense of dread, but it wasn't just the house's oppressive atmosphere that weighed on her. It was her own mind, unraveling, pulling her further from reality. The images, the memories, everything seemed to be converging in ways she could no longer understand. What had once been an investigation into the mansion's mysteries had turned into a relentless confrontation with her own fractured psyche. As she turned another corner, she found herself in a dimly lit study, its shelves lined with ancient, dust-covered books. The air smelled of mildew and forgotten knowledge, and a large oak desk sat in the center of the room, cluttered with papers and artifacts. Eleanor hesitated, then stepped forward, her mind swirling with questions she could no longer contain. Was the mansion tormenting her for a reason? Or had she come to this place because she was finally ready to face whatever she had buried so deep within herself? It was at that moment, as her hand brushed the edge of the desk, that she noticed something strange, something far more unsettling than the ghosts of the past she had encountered so far. One of the papers, seemingly discarded, was a journal. Her breath hitched as she picked it up, her name scrawled across the front in a handwriting she recognized. It was her own. The journal seemed out of place, as if it had appeared there without explanation, and yet the familiarity of the handwriting struck her with an icy certainty. How could this be? How could it have been written by her if she had no memory of doing so? Opening the journal, she scanned the pages. The ink was smudged, as if the writer had been shaking with fear. Her own words, written in a frantic, disjointed script, filled the pages. She read them aloud to herself, each sentence causing a strange feeling of déjà vu, as if she had written them in some forgotten moment long ago. I can feel it. The mansion calls to me, but I don't know why. It holds something from my past that I must uncover, or I will never escape. The walls whisper my name, calling me to face what I've done, what I've forgotten. The words struck her like a blow to the chest. She had no memory of writing these things. Yet here they were, and they were undeniably hers. As she continued to read, the journal became more and more cryptic, detailing disturbing images and fractured memories that she could not place. Visions of her childhood home, her brother's disappearance, the face of a man she had never met, yet somehow felt intimately connected to. Each line blurred the boundary between reality and nightmare, until the journal felt like a mirror reflecting back not just her past, but a future she was destined to confront. And then she reached the final entry, written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. I can hear them now. The voices, the footsteps, the whispers. They're inside me, inside my mind. I have to leave, but the mansion won't let me go. If I stay, I will never leave. If I leave, I will never know the truth. Eleanor slammed the journal shut, her heart racing. It was too much. The words were too familiar, too real. The mansion wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a manifestation of her own guilt and regret. She had thought she was seeking the truth about the mansion, but now she realized that what she was truly searching for was an escape from herself. The room around her seemed to distort, the shadows lengthening, twisting into forms that seemed to shift just beyond her peripheral vision. She could hear footsteps now, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the halls. Were they real? Were they a trick of her mind? Eleanor could no longer trust her senses, and that was the most terrifying realization of all. She stood there in the study, paralyzed by the weight of her own unraveling thoughts. The mansion, with all its secrets, was not just playing with her mind. It was forcing her to confront the horrors she had been avoiding for so long. Each room she entered, each memory she unearthed, only added to the feeling that she was losing herself, that she was becoming part of the house, just as much as the walls and the dust and the darkness. The door behind her creaked open with a groan, and a voice called out her name. It was soft, almost tender, but there was something wrong with it, something that made her blood run cold. The voice was hers, but it wasn't. It was the voice of someone who knew her far too well, someone who had been inside her mind, waiting for the moment to speak. Eleanor, it whispered again, closer now, as if the very walls were speaking her name. Come find me. Come see what you've done. The words sent a shock of terror through her. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one there. Only the darkness of the hallway beyond. Eleanor was alone, or so she thought. Yet the voice lingered, its words wrapping around her mind like a vice, pulling her deeper into the madness of the mansion. Her eyes darted to the walls, the shadows, the corners of the room. There was something else there, something she hadn't noticed before. A shape, moving just at the edge of her vision. It was human, but not. Its form was a distortion, a reflection of something that shouldn't exist, something that was once real, but now only a memory, twisted and broken. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she backed away, the room now closing in on her. The shape moved closer, its presence more suffocating than the air around her. She knew, deep in her bones, that it was not just a shadow, it was her. A reflection of her, but one that was lost, one that she had abandoned long ago. This was the moment. The mansion had lured her here, not to uncover its secrets, but to force her to confront the most terrifying truth of all. The thing she had been running from, the thing that had been haunting her all along, was herself. The mansion wasn't just a place. It was a mirror, and Eleanor was staring into it, finally forced to face the horrors that had always been lurking just beneath the surface. The question was no longer whether she could escape the mansion. It was whether she could escape herself. Eleanor's heart pounded as the shape in the doorway inched closer, its distorted form flickering in and out of existence, like a mirage that was both real and imagined. She felt an overwhelming compulsion to move, to run, but her feet felt as if they were rooted to the ground. The mansion was no longer just an eerie, abandoned place. It had become an extension of her mind, a labyrinth of her own making, filled with the shadows of her deepest regrets. The weight of this realization bore down on her chest, suffocating her with its intensity. There was no escape, not from the house, and not from herself. The distorted figure took another step forward, and Eleanor's breath hitched. The voice she had heard earlier, soft and seductive, echoed through the room again, this time more urgent, more insistent. You've been running from this, Eleanor. Running from what you've done, what you've lost. But you can't outrun it forever. You need to face it. You need to see it for what it truly is. The words sent a chill through her, not because of their malicious intent, but because of their truth. She had been running, hadn't she? Running from memories, from choices she had made, from the guilt that had gnawed at her for years. But it wasn't just the mansion that held her prisoner. It was the burden of her own actions, the weight of a past she could never escape. The mansion was merely a manifestation of that burden, a place where the ghosts of her regrets and mistakes came alive. She clenched her fists, trying to force herself to take control, to regain some semblance of power over the situation. But how could she? The figure before her was her own reflection, a twisted version of herself that had taken shape in this forsaken place. It wasn't just the house that had been haunting her. It was herself, her own inner demons, her inability to move on from the past. The figure finally stepped into the room, its features becoming more defined, more solid. It was Eleanor, but not. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, her eyes hollow and empty. There was something hauntingly familiar about the way it moved, something unsettling in the way it mimicked her every gesture. It was as though she were staring at a version of herself that had been drained of all warmth, all humanity, left only with the cold, unyielding presence of regret. "Why do you run from me?" the figure whispered, its voice eerily similar to her own. "I am you, Eleanor. I am the part of you that you've tried to forget, the part you've locked away in the darkest corners of your mind. But I've always been here. I've always been with you." The words hit Eleanor like a slap to the face. The realization that the figure before her was a reflection of her own guilt and sorrow cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. She had tried to bury the truth, to shut away the memories that tormented her, but they had followed her here, into this mansion, and they would never let her go. "Do you remember?" the figure asked, its voice growing more insistent. "Do you remember what you did? What you left behind?" Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling. She tried to block out the voice, but it was impossible. The memories came flooding back, unbidden and overwhelming. She saw the faces of those she had hurt, the opportunities she had squandered, the relationships she had destroyed. It was as though the walls of the mansion had become a living, breathing archive of her mistakes, each room a new reminder of what she had lost. And now, in this moment, she could no longer escape them. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted any of this." But the figure only smiled, a hollow, empty smile that didn't reach its eyes. "Intentions don't matter, Eleanor. It's the consequences that remain. You can't undo what you've done. You can't erase the damage you've caused." Her knees weakened as the weight of her past pressed down on her. She had always believed that time would heal all wounds, that the years would eventually dull the pain of her mistakes. But here, in the mansion, surrounded by the echoes of her own regrets, time had no meaning. The past was alive, tangible, and it was demanding her attention. There was no way to outrun it. There was no way to forget it. She sank to the floor, her hands trembling as they clutched at her head. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. The pressure was too much. Every memory, every mistake, every lost opportunity crashed over her like a tidal wave, drowning her in guilt and despair. She had spent so long pretending that she could move on, pretending that the past no longer mattered, but it was all still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it would break free. "Please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know how to make it right." The figure regarded her coldly, its eyes empty and unfeeling. "Sorry won't change anything. It never does. But you know that already, don't you? You've always known." The room around her seemed to close in, the walls pressing in tighter with each passing second. The air grew thick, suffocating. Eleanor could feel herself slipping, her mind unraveling, her sense of reality fading. The mansion was no longer just a place. It was a reflection of her very soul, a prison of her own making. She had come here seeking answers, but now she understood that the mansion wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was a reckoning, and the truth was far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. She had been running from herself all along, and now there was nowhere left to hide. The mansion was quiet again, but not in the way a place should be silent. It was an oppressive, weighted silence, one that seemed alive with anticipation. Eleanor sat on the cold, wooden floor of the parlor, her breath shallow and erratic, her mind racing with the haunting truths that had emerged in the previous hours. The figure, her distorted double, had vanished into the shadows, leaving only its words behind. Yet, those words hung in the air, seeping into the walls, the floor, the very marrow of the house. "I can't stay here," she whispered, more to herself than to the house. But as soon as the words escaped her lips, the walls seemed to murmur in response. It was faint at first, like the distant rustling of leaves in the wind, but then it grew louder, more defined. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, a hushed chorus of voices speaking in fragmented sentences. "She knows, but won't leave. Deeper than she thinks, beneath the surface. Always been here." Eleanor pressed her hands to her ears, willing the whispers to stop, but they only grew louder. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was as though the mansion itself were speaking, the whispers weaving through its structure, carried along the ancient cracks and crevices of the walls. She tried to focus on her breathing, to drown out the sound with her thoughts, but the mansion wouldn't let her. The whispers began to form clearer phrases now, urging her, beckoning her. "Go below, seek the root." Where it began, her stomach churned. "Below," she said aloud, her voice trembling. The mansion had a basement. She'd seen the door to it when she first entered. It had been locked then, a blessing she had taken for granted. But now, it felt inevitable. Whatever force governed this place wouldn't let her leave until she faced whatever lay beneath its foundations. Eleanor stood on unsteady legs, her flashlight trembling in her grip as she moved toward the hallway. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound reverberating back at her with an almost mocking tone. The whispers followed her, ebbing and flowing like a tide, as if guiding her to the door. When she reached it, the door was no longer locked. It hung slightly ajar, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. A cold draft seeped out, carrying with it a damp, earthy smell that made her stomach turn. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back, to run, but she knew there was no escape from this place. Not until she confronted the truth hidden within its depths. The steps creaked beneath her weight as she descended, her flashlight beams slicing through the thick darkness. The walls were closer here, rough and uneven, as if the mansion had been carved out of the earth itself. The whispers grew fainter, but more concentrated, as though the very essence of the house were pulling inward, drawing her toward its core. The basement was larger than she had imagined, its walls lined with old wooden shelves filled with crumbling books and jars of unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a massive, circular stone set into the floor, inscribed with strange, angular symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. Eleanor's flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, leaving her in the dim, otherworldly light of the symbols. As she approached the stone, she could feel its energy pulsing, as if it were alive. The whispers had faded entirely now, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. Eleanor knelt beside it, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch its surface. The moment her fingers brushed the stone, a shock of cold shot through her, and the hum grew louder, filling her head with a cacophony of sounds and voices. Images flashed before her eyes, fragments of memories, both hers and others she didn't recognize. A child crying in the darkness, a woman shouting in desperation, a man standing in the rain, holding something heavy in his hands. It was as if the stone were a repository of the mansion's history, each memory etched into its surface like a scar. Then she saw it, a vision so vivid it felt like she was living it. The mansion, in its prime, filled with life and laughter. But there was something wrong beneath the surface, a darkness that had been present from the very beginning. A man, the original owner, stood over the stone, chanting in a language Eleanor didn't understand. Around him, figures knelt in a circle, their faces obscured. The air was thick with tension, the weight of something immense and unnatural pressing down on the room. The vision ended abruptly, and Eleanor was thrown back onto the cold, hard floor of the basement. She gasped for breath, her head spinning, her heart racing. The stone was silent now, its glow dimming as though it had exhausted its energy. Eleanor realized the mansion's whispers weren't just taunts, they were warnings. Whatever had been done here beneath the house had set something in motion, something that couldn't be undone. And now she was caught in its web. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself to her feet. She knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. The stone had shown her just enough to know there was more to uncover, more to understand. But with each step she took deeper into the mansion's mysteries, she felt the weight of its grip tightening around her, pulling her further from the world she had once known. Whatever awaited her next, she knew it would be darker still. The basement air was suffocating, heavy with dampness and the scent of mildew. Eleanor leaned against the cold wall, her breathing uneven as her mind reeled from the visions the stone had shown her. She felt as though she had touched the very heart of the mansion, and it had recoiled at her presence. The glowing inscriptions on the stone were burned into her memory, their jagged forms hinting at something ancient and incomprehensible. She took a shaky step toward the shelves, her flashlight flickering back to life as if it had been waiting for her resolve to return. The jars and books that lined the shelves seemed untouched by time, though their surfaces were coated with a thick layer of dust. Each object exuded an aura of quiet menace, as though they were aware of her presence and disapproved. One book in particular drew her attention. Bound in cracked, blackened leather, it bore no title on its spine or cover. Eleanor hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers tingling with anticipation and dread. The moment she touched the book, she felt a jolt, as though the object had recognized her. The whispers, faint and far away now, surged for a moment, and then receded, leaving her in eerie silence. Opening the book, she found its pages filled with spidery handwriting, the ink faded but legible. The text was a mix of languages, Latin, Old English, and something she couldn't recognize, its glyphs jagged and alien. She turned the pages carefully, feeling as though each word carried a weight she wasn't meant to bear. Midway through the book, she found a list of names, each meticulously written in the same cramped script. Some names were crossed out with thick, angry lines, while others were encircled with strange symbols. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she scanned the list. Near the bottom, she saw her own name, written clearly and without embellishment. Her stomach twisted, and she dropped the book as if it had burned her. The sound of the book hitting the floor reverberated unnaturally, echoing far longer than it should have. Eleanor staggered back, her mind racing. "Why is my name in this book?" she whispered. The question felt absurd in the emptiness of the basement, but the silence that followed was heavier than the whispers had been. Something on the floor, beneath the stone, caught her eye. A faint glimmer, barely perceptible, drew her gaze to a small crack in the stone circle. Kneeling, she saw what looked like the corner of a piece of parchment jutting from the crevice. Using the edge of her flashlight, she pried it free, the brittle paper disintegrating slightly as she unfolded it. The parchment was a map, though its proportions didn't match the mansion she had explored. It depicted the house as it must have been centuries ago, but there were additional rooms and corridors that no longer existed, or perhaps had been hidden. Most unsettling of all was the red X marked in the basement, directly where she now stood. Her surroundings seemed to shift as she stared at the map. The walls of the basement felt closer, the shadows darker and more oppressive. The whispers returned, faint and pleading, as if the house itself were trying to warn her. "Eleanor," a voice said, clear and close. She spun around, her flashlight darting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The voice had been unmistakably familiar. Her own. Panic clawed at her, but beneath it, a strange curiosity pulled her deeper. She pocketed the map and the book, determined to unravel the mansion's secrets. If her name was in that book, then this was personal. She had been drawn here for a reason, and the answers lay ahead, no matter how terrifying they might be. As she climbed the stairs back to the main floor, the air grew colder, and the house seemed to hum with a sinister energy. The walls creaked and groaned as if alive, watching her every move. Eleanor tried to steady her resolve. She could feel the mansion testing her, its darkness trying to seep into her mind and break her spirit. Reaching the parlor, she unfolded the map again. Her fingers traced the faint outlines of the hidden rooms, her thoughts churning. She didn't know whether she was being guided by the mansion or defying it, but either way, she was determined to uncover the truth. The next step was clear. She had to find the hidden passages marked on the map and uncover whatever the house was trying so desperately to conceal. But as she stared at the map, she realized something chilling. The red X that had marked the basement was gone, replaced by a new location on the second floor. Whatever the mansion wanted her to see next, it was already waiting for her. Eleanor felt the weight of the map pressing against her chest as she climbed the staircase, its fragile folds tucked into her jacket pocket. Her steps were cautious, the wooden stairs groaning beneath her feet as though warning her to turn back. The red X on the second floor had burned itself into her mind, a haunting beacon pulling her forward. She glanced upward, the dim glow of her flashlight catching the edges of the ornate balustrade, and wondered how the mansion seemed to grow darker with every passing moment. The second floor greeted her with an icy draft that made her shiver. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, its patterned wallpaper curling at the edges and the floorboards creaking ominously beneath her weight. The air smelled of decayed wood and something metallic, sharp and unfamiliar. Eleanor's eyes darted from door to door, each identical to the last, as if the mansion were mocking her sense of direction. She pulled out the map and traced her finger along the faded lines, orienting herself. The red X marked a room near the eastern end of the hallway. Yet as she walked, the distance seemed interminable, the doors blurring together until she wasn't sure how far she had come. Finally, she stopped in front of a door that matched the one on the map. A heavy oak slab with intricate carvings of vines and flowers, their once delicate patterns now warped and sinister. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. The whispers, which had been distant and disjointed until now, swelled in volume, as though urging her onward. Steeling herself, she turned the knob and pushed the door open, the hinges shrieking in protest. Inside, the room was eerily pristine compared to the rest of the mansion. A four-poster bed draped in crimson velvet dominated the space, its headboard carved with scenes of forests and rivers. A gilded mirror hung on the opposite wall, reflecting the room in distorted clarity. The centerpiece of the room, however, was a writing desk beneath the window. Papers were scattered across its surface, and a quill pen lay askew, as though someone had left in haste. Eleanor approached cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the desk's contents. The papers were filled with frantic scrawls in the same jagged handwriting as the book she had found in the basement. Phrases like, "The house remembers," and "They cannot be undone," repeated over and over, interspersed with diagrams of the mansion. As Eleanor sifted through the papers, she found a journal bound in faded leather. Opening it, she saw the same cramped handwriting, though these entries seemed more coherent. The journal chronicled the life of someone named Margaret, one of the names she had seen in the basement book. Margaret wrote of moving into the mansion with her husband, of their excitement to restore its grandeur, and of the strange occurrences that began soon after. The final entry stopped mid-sentence. The walls, they shift. They watch. They wait. Before Eleanor could process the words, the room seemed to shudder. She froze, clutching the journal, as the floor beneath her feet felt alive, vibrating with a low, rhythmic hum. The mirror across the room rippled, the reflection distorting as though it were liquid instead of glass. Eleanor's pulse raced as she stepped back, her flashlight trained on the mirror. Then it moved. Not her reflection, but something behind her, a dark figure shifting in the corner of the glass. Spinning around, she found nothing there, only the oppressive emptiness of the room. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone, replaced by her wide-eyed, trembling reflection. The walls began to creak, the sound rising to a groan as the room seemed to contract around her. Eleanor stumbled toward the door, but when she reached for the knob, it was gone. The door frame had smoothed into an unbroken expanse of wood, trapping her inside. Panic clawed at her throat as she pounded on the wall, her fists thudding uselessly against the unyielding surface. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of overlapping voices that filled her head. "Let me out," she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive noise. Her flashlight flickered, plunging her into darkness before sputtering back to life. In the brief flash of light, she saw the room had changed. The bed, the desk, the mirror were gone, replaced by empty, crumbling walls. And then she saw it, etched into the wall opposite her, another red X, glowing faintly. Beneath it, a single word scratched deep into the wood. "Next." Eleanor's breath hitched as the walls began to close in, forcing her to move toward the glowing mark. She pressed her trembling hand to the X, and with a sharp crack, the wall opened, revealing a hidden passage that descended into the shadows below. Gritting her teeth, she stepped through the opening, leaving the suffocating room behind. As the wall sealed itself shut behind her, she realized that the mansion was not simply guiding her. It was hunting her, pushing her deeper into its labyrinth. The rules of reality no longer applied here, and Eleanor knew there was no going back. Eleanor descended into the darkness, each step of the hidden staircase groaning underfoot. The faint glow of the flashlight bounced erratically on the stone walls, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. The air grew colder with every step, carrying the stench of mildew and damp earth. Her chest tightened with the claustrophobic realization that the mansion's oppressive architecture was forcing her deeper into its labyrinthine depths. She wondered how far underground she might already be and whether there would ever be a way out. The stairs spiraled endlessly, and Eleanor's legs burned with exertion as the descent seemed to stretch for hours. Her grip on the journal tightened, the scrawled warnings within feeling heavier now. Margaret's final words haunted her. The walls shift. They watch. They wait. Eleanor paused, pressing her hand against the stone wall to steady herself. The cold surface pulsed faintly under her touch, as though the house itself had a heartbeat. She snatched her hand away and shuddered, resuming her cautious descent. At last, the staircase ended abruptly, opening into a cavernous chamber. The beam of her flashlight struggled to illuminate the massive space, revealing stone pillars carved with symbols that looked ancient and otherworldly. The floor was uneven, cobbled with jagged rocks and scattered debris that hinted at a time long before the mansion stood above. In the center of the room was a circular dais, its surface etched with a spiraling design that drew Eleanor's gaze like a whirlpool. She approached the dais slowly, her steps echoing unnaturally loud in the vast chamber. The whispers returned, but they no longer felt distant. Instead, they reverberated through the air like a dissonant chorus, their fragmented syllables worming their way into her ears. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the markings on the dais. They resembled the map she had found earlier, but this time, the lines weren't static. They writhed and shifted like living veins, pulsating in time with the oppressive hum that filled the room. As she stood transfixed, the shadows around the dais began to shift, growing thicker and darker until they coalesced into shapes. Figures emerged, tall, faceless forms cloaked in flickering darkness. Their heads tilted unnaturally as they regarded her, their featureless faces somehow filled with malice. Eleanor backed away instinctively, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The figures moved closer, their bodies gliding soundlessly over the uneven ground. In a moment of desperation, Eleanor remembered the journal. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning frantically for anything that might help. Her flashlight caught on a page near the end, its text scrawled in capital letters. "Do not run. Speak the name." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. What name? She flipped back through the pages, her pulse racing as the figures closed in. Then she saw it, buried in a previous entry. Lacarthos. The figures loomed over her now, their presence pressing down like a physical weight. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, Eleanor shouted the name. Lacarthos. The word echoed through the chamber, silencing the whispers and halting the figures in their tracks. The air around her vibrated violently, and the figures began to dissolve, their forms unraveling into threads of shadow that were drawn back into the dais. The spiraling pattern on the dais flared with light, and the ground beneath Eleanor's feet trembled. A loud crack split the air, and the dais began to sink, revealing a staircase leading even deeper into the earth. The pulsating hum returned, louder and more insistent now, as if the mansion was displeased with her discovery. Eleanor hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but the way she had come was gone. The chamber around her began to collapse, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling as dust filled the air. Eleanor coughed, shielding her face as she stumbled toward the staircase. She had no choice but to descend. With one last glance at the dissolving room, she stepped onto the narrow stairs, the light of the dais fading behind her. As she moved deeper, the air grew warmer, carrying a strange metallic tang that set her nerves on edge. The staircase was narrower than before, the walls closing in as if trying to crush her. She clutched the journal tightly, her only anchor in this descent into madness. The whispers returned, now a cacophony that seemed to come from within her own mind. They spoke in tongues she didn't understand, yet their intent felt clear. You are not supposed to be here. Eleanor pressed forward, her steps slowing as exhaustion and dread weighed her down. She had thought the mansion was a prison, but now it felt more like a trap, one designed to lure her into something far older and more malevolent than she could comprehend. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, a faint glow appeared ahead, illuminating another chamber. This time, she felt no relief, only the sinking realization that she was walking into the heart of the mansion's secrets. Eleanor emerged into a space unlike any she had seen before, a vast hall that felt both ancient and unnatural. The walls were lined with towering pillars of obsidian, their surfaces polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflecting her trembling figure in distorted, nightmarish ways. The floor beneath her feet was smooth and black, as if carved from a single massive slab of stone, and the air carried a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. A soft, pulsing light filled the hall, its source unclear, casting eerie, shifting patterns on the walls. She moved cautiously, each step echoing far longer than it should, as though the sound was trapped and stretched by the space itself. Her flashlight sputtered and died, but the hall's ambient glow was enough to see by, though she almost wished it wasn't. Carved into the pillars were countless faces, each frozen in expressions of anguish or terror. Their eyes, hollow voids, seemed to track her every movement. At the center of the hall stood a monolithic structure, a throne-like seat carved from the same obsidian as the pillars, its surface etched with symbols that writhed and shifted when she looked at them too long. Around it, a series of concentric circles were embedded in the floor, each inscribed with more symbols and patterns that seemed to hum with latent power. As Eleanor approached, the whispers in her mind grew louder, more urgent, though still incomprehensible. She felt drawn to the throne, an inexplicable compulsion pulling her forward. Her hands trembled as she stepped into the first circle, and the hum in the air intensified, vibrating through her bones. The journal in her hand grew hot, almost burning, as if warning her to stop. She flipped it open, desperate for guidance, and found a passage scrawled in frantic, jagged handwriting. The seat is not for you. To sit is to submit. Her breath caught, and she took a step back, but the compulsion only grew stronger. She could feel the pull in her chest, like a hook lodged deep in her soul, dragging her closer. The throne seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, its symbols glowing faintly as though responding to her presence. She resisted the urge to reach out, but her fingers twitched involuntarily, drawn toward the slick, black surface. As she stood there, the whispers coalesced into a single voice, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It spoke in a language she didn't recognize, yet the meaning crystallized in her mind. You have come too far. There is no turning back. Suddenly, the floor beneath her began to shift, the circles spinning like gears in a massive, unseen machine. The symbols on the throne flared brighter, and a blinding light shot upward from its base, forming a column that pierced the ceiling far above. The faces on the pillars twisted and writhed, their mouths opening in silent screams. The hum in the air became a deafening roar, and Eleanor fell to her knees, clutching her head as pain lanced through her skull. Through the blinding light and cacophony, she saw a figure materialize on the throne. It was humanoid but wrong, its body a shifting mass of shadow and light, with limbs that bent in impossible angles. Its face was a void, a featureless expanse that seemed to suck in the surrounding light. The figure turned its head toward Eleanor, and though it had no eyes, she felt its gaze pierce through her. The figure raised an arm, and the light column dimmed, leaving the hall bathed in a sickly, greenish glow. The whispers in Eleanor's mind stopped abruptly, replaced by a cold, suffocating silence. The figure spoke, its voice a low rumble that reverberated through her very core. You seek what you cannot understand. This place is not yours to claim. Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice failed her. The figure rose from the throne, its form towering and insubstantial, yet its presence filled the hall with an overwhelming sense of dread. It stepped forward, and with each movement, the symbols on the floor glowed brighter, pulsating like a heartbeat. Eleanor's survival instincts finally kicked in, and she scrambled backward, desperate to put distance between herself and the advancing figure. The journal fell from her grasp, landing open on the floor. The figure stopped and looked down at the pages, its featureless face somehow conveying a flicker of recognition. Or was it disdain? The figure extended a shadowy hand toward the journal, and the pages burst into flames. Eleanor cried out, lunging to grab it, but the fire consumed it almost instantly, leaving behind only ash. She stared in horror as the ashes scattered, carried away by an unseen breeze. The figure turned its attention back to her, and its voice echoed once more. You are out of time. The mansion will decide your fate. Before Eleanor could react, the floor beneath her gave way, and she fell into darkness, her screams swallowed by the abyss. Eleanor awoke in a void that defied logic. The space around her was infinite, yet oppressive, filled with a suffocating blackness that felt alive. Her body ached from the fall, though there was no ground beneath her, only the sensation of standing on something unseen. Her breath formed clouds, though the air was neither cold nor warm, just an unbearable nothingness. Before her, a dim light flickered and expanded, revealing a circle of towering, featureless figures. They were robed in shifting shadows, their forms devoid of detail, yet radiating authority. The air around them crackled with energy, each movement sending tremors through the void. Eleanor's instincts screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. One of the figures stepped forward, its presence overwhelming. It spoke without a mouth, its voice reverberating in Eleanor's mind, bypassing her ears entirely. You have trespassed into the eternal. The words were not a question or an accusation. They were a statement, final and unyielding. Eleanor's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. I was drawn here. She held her arms up defensively, as if the gesture could shield her from their judgment. The figures exchanged no words, but their collective hum intensified, vibrating through Eleanor's bones. Another stepped forward, this one emanating an aura of curiosity. Its voice, softer yet no less commanding, echoed in her mind. You sought the answers. You followed the path. Now, you stand before us. Why? Eleanor struggled to form coherent thoughts. The mansion, its history, the people who disappeared. I thought I could uncover the truth, stop whatever is happening here. She gestured vaguely at the void. I thought it was just a curse or some hidden evil. I didn't know it was this. The figures tilted their heads in unison, a gesture so unnatural it sent a chill down her spine. The first figure spoke again, its tone colder this time. You believed you could contain what is eternal. Foolish. The circle closed in slightly, their forms blurring together, becoming a wall of shifting shadows. The third figure, smaller than the rest, but no less imposing, addressed her. Its voice was laced with what might have been pity. What lies within this place is not meant for understanding. It is not bound by the rules of your world. Eleanor clenched her fists, anger cutting through her fear. If it's so beyond us, why was I able to get this far? Why lure people here, only to destroy them? The figures fell silent for a moment, the void itself seeming to hold its breath. Finally, the first figure answered, its voice colder than the void. We do not lure. We do not destroy. Those who come here seek us, knowingly or not. You are a vessel for what lies beyond comprehension. And now, you must choose. Eleanor's heart pounded as the figures parted, revealing a gateway of swirling light and darkness. The portal pulsed with an energy that called to her, filling her with equal parts dread and longing. Choose? What am I choosing? She demanded, her voice rising in desperation. The softer voice returned, almost compassionate. Step through, and you become one of us. The knowledge you seek will be yours, but at the cost of your humanity. Turn away, and you return to your world, ignorant but whole. The choice is eternal. There is no going back. Eleanor's thoughts raced. She had spent her life chasing answers, determined to uncover the truth at all costs. But was it worth losing herself? The mansion, the horror she had witnessed, the lives lost, they demanded justice, resolution. Yet the idea of becoming something incomprehensible, abandoning her own existence, filled her with unspeakable terror. The figures began to chant, their voices weaving together in a haunting harmony that resonated through the void. The portal flared brighter, its energy almost tangible now, wrapping around her like an unseen hand. Her body moved of its own accord, one step closer to the gateway. No, she whispered, planting her feet. I'm not ready. Not like this. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the void seemed to ripple with disapproval. The first figure loomed closer, its shadowy form towering over her. Then leave. But know this, you carry the mark of this place. It will never leave you. The eternal watches always. Before Eleanor could respond, the ground beneath her gave way, and she plummeted once more, her screams echoing into the darkness. The last thing she saw was the gateway, its light fading as the figures turned away, their judgment complete. She landed with a jarring thud on the cold, stone floor of the mansion. The familiar scent of mildew and decay filled her lungs. The portal was gone, the void a memory, but the whisper of the eternal remained, a faint hum at the edge of her mind, a promise of something she could never fully escape. Eleanor lay motionless on the stone floor, her breath ragged and shallow. The dim, flickering light of the mansion's grand chandelier was the first thing her eyes registered, a faint glow that felt out of place after the blinding intensity of the void. Her body ached, though the pain seemed more spiritual than physical, as if a piece of her had been ripped away. The chanting voices, the faceless council, and the swirling portal lingered in her memory, like a half-remembered nightmare. She wasn't sure how much of it had been real until she saw the mark. Her trembling hand brushed her forearm, where an intricate, swirling pattern now adorned her skin. The mark glowed faintly in the dim light, pulsing in sync with her heartbeat. She could feel it, a foreign energy coursing through her veins, whispering truths she wasn't ready to hear. The Eternal wasn't done with her. It never would be. As she pulled herself to her feet, the mansion seemed different. The oppressive silence was replaced by faint murmurs, indistinct voices echoing through the halls. The walls, once decayed and crumbling, now shimmered with an unnatural sheen, as if they were alive. Shadows danced along the edges of her vision, too fluid and deliberate to be tricks of the light. The mansion was breathing, watching, waiting. Eleanor staggered toward the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing louder than they should have. The air was heavy, charged with an electric tension that made her skin crawl. As she reached the base of the stairs, she noticed a figure standing at the top. It was human in shape, but its features were obscured, shifting and flickering like a poorly tuned television. "Who are you?" Eleanor's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but the figure responded immediately. "You carry the mark." Its voice was layered, a cacophony of tones that made her ears ache. "You have glimpsed the eternal. You are part of it now." "I didn't ask for this," she shouted, her anger overpowering her fear. "I just wanted to stop the horror, to save the people this place has swallowed. What's the point of all this if I can't change anything?" The figure descended the staircase, each step making the mansion tremble. Its presence was overwhelming, yet Eleanor stood her ground. As it reached the bottom step, it extended a hand, palm up, revealing a swirling orb of light and darkness. "You misunderstand. The eternal does not take. It reveals. What you do with that revelation is your choice." Eleanor stared at the orb, mesmerized by its shifting patterns. The voices in the mansion grew louder, a rising chorus that seemed to emanate from the orb itself. She saw flashes of faces, those of the people who had vanished, their expressions frozen in terror and awe. "Where are they?" she demanded. "The ones who disappeared. What happened to them?" The figure tilted its head, a gesture both alien and eerily familiar. "They are part of the eternal, as you will be in time, but your path is not yet complete." Eleanor's frustration boiled over. "I don't want to be part of this. I just want it to end." She reached for the orb, driven by equal parts desperation and defiance. The moment her fingers touched its surface, the world around her exploded into light and sound. She was no longer in the mansion, but standing on a precipice overlooking an infinite expanse of stars, each one pulsing with life and meaning. The mark on her arm burned, its glow intensifying until it engulfed her entire being. In that moment, she saw everything: the history of the mansion, the fate of those who had come before her, the true nature of the eternal. It wasn't evil or malicious. It was a force of existence, indifferent and infinite. The mansion was its gateway, a thin veil between the mortal world and something far beyond comprehension. When the vision faded, Eleanor was back in the mansion, alone. The figure was gone, and the orb had disappeared. The murmurs had quieted, replaced by the distant sound of the wind. The mark on her arm no longer glowed, but she could still feel its presence, a constant reminder of what she had seen. She stepped outside, the mansion's front door creaking loudly as it swung open. The night air was crisp and clean, the stars above twinkling innocently, oblivious to the horrors she had endured. As she walked down the overgrown path, the weight of the eternal settled in her chest. Not a burden, but a responsibility. Eleanor didn't know what she would do with the knowledge she had gained. She only knew one thing: her life and the world she thought she understood would never be the same. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the veil of reality, the eternal watched and waited, its whispers following her into the night.